Too shortly. Here on BBC One Scotland now, the BBC News with Michael Burke. It's 9 o'clock.
12 million people's lives are at risk in a new Ethiopian famine. The UN's appealing for help as the Horn of Africa dries up. Verdict on Microsoft. The courts could order it to be broken up. And the Premiership's planning the biggest shake-up of football on television for a decade. Good evening. Famines return to the Horn of Africa. The UN's appealed for help to the outside world and says as many as 12 million people's lives may be at risk. Thousands are already on the move, abandoning their homes in an increasingly desperate search for water. The spring rains have failed again, and the Horn of Africa is scorched dry. In Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti and northern Kenya, years of low rainfall are now wiping out crops and livestock. Years of war have made the crisis worse. There are now grave food shortages across the region. In southeast Ethiopia, the vulnerable, the elderly and the very young are already dying. From Denan, the BBC's Raghi Omar reports. The pictures may upset you.
This should be the season of rain in eastern Ethiopia, but instead, on the road to Denan, we found nothing but emptiness in this parched land. Drought has gripped this region now for 4 years. Tens of thousands have migrated from their villages in search of water. They've come to makeshift camps like this on the edge of Denan, which is now home to 24,000 people. So many have been sapped of all their strength, but it is the young children who are the most vulnerable. Preliminary nutritional information gathered by local officials is bleak. A quarter of the children under 5 in Denan weigh half their normal body weight. Severe malnutrition has weakened them so much that few of them can withstand the outbreaks of diseases like measles and tuberculosis. The elders of the village say at least 6 children under 5 are dying every day. Bashara is 5 months old. But there are no facilities for children like her in Denan. No feeding centres, no doctors or nurses, not even a box of medicines. Local officials say they just don't have the resources to cope.
I don't think the drugs we have now is available to address the need of the people. We are trying to do something, but it's something beyond our capacity. So that international help is necessary at this time. Quick international help. They need food, they need shelter, they need drugs, they need water, or something we cannot manage ourselves alone.
Everywhere in Denan, you see hunger and deprivation. Mothers in particular face a cruel plight. They have to face the agony of watching their children slowly starve whilst they can do nothing to provide for them. We had been in the village for only an hour when we saw relatives gathered around a hut. Malnutrition had just claimed another child's life. Her name was Irshi, and she was just 2 years old. Having lost his whole herd of cattle, Abdi Sigid trekked with his family for 1 week to reach Denan, only to find further suffering. He lost 2 of his children on the journey. He says that all the nomads in this region face the same catastrophe. The roads around the village are littered with the carcasses of dead animals. There's hardly anything left of the herds on which so many people depend. The nearest well, which still has some water, is 8 miles away, but this precious resource is now being brought to Denan by truck. This crisis is now at the emergency stage, and plentiful supplies of water could be the only thing to prevent a major disaster. But there's still not enough water for so many people. And all the time, lives are being lost. Within the last 24 hours, this desolate graveyard has swelled, with 21 people having been buried here. Without water, food and medicines, there's hardly anything which is going to stop this trend. So much time has already been lost. Denan is a snapshot of the situation emerging across the Horn of Africa. Countries like Ethiopia are doing their best to cope, but the international community will have to come to this region's aid if the worst is to be avoided. Raghi Omar, BBC News, Danan, Ethiopia.
A court decision which could decide the fate of the computer giant Microsoft is expected in the next hour. A judge in America will rule on whether the company abused its position as the world's biggest provider of personal computer software. If he rules that Microsoft did break anti-competition laws, the company could be forcibly split up. Tonight, Microsoft's shares dropped sharply.
90% of the world's computer users see this symbol when they switch on. The Windows operating system has given Microsoft huge wealth and power. Tonight, a judge in Washington appears certain to rule that the company has abused that power to stifle competition. Over the weekend, peace talks between Bill Gates' company and the US government collapsed. Microsoft officials claim the government's actions could harm the whole industry.
One of the fundamental issues about this court case is around the right to innovate. So I suggest if we actually were to lose the court case, the right to innovate is not only our right to innovate, it's all those other thousands of people who work in this industry. So if we can't innovate, nobody else can innovate.
But it's the way Microsoft has used Windows as a battering ram against rivals, which has been at the centre of this trial. When a browser, the software used to surf the internet, was integrated into Windows, computer users soon started ditching Netscape, which had dominated this market. Microsoft's lawyers are expecting a damning ruling tonight, with the judge finding that their company has broken competition laws. The debate then moves on to possible penalties. The judge might break up the company, ordering Microsoft to split into 3 separate businesses. He could order it to open its source code, giving competitors access to the secrets behind Windows. He could insist on fair pricing, or he could create a series of mini Microsofts, identical but rival versions of the same company. Shares in the world's most valuable business fell sharply as the verdict was awaited. But the impact of any breakup of Microsoft on the rest of the economy may now make the American government cautious.
The American government is concerned that if Microsoft is dismembered, there might be a domino effect on the American economy. Because Microsoft, after all, is the most visible software company in the world, and certainly it is the most successful software company in the world.
In an election year, Microsoft is encouraging computer users to lobby in its favour, and it's promising to take the case to lengthy appeals. While this marathon battle has been going on, the computer industry has changed beyond all recognition, and when it's finally concluded, new arrivals may have appeared on the scene to give Microsoft just the kind of competition the US government wants to promote. Rory Catherine-Jones, BBC News.
And there'll be details of that Microsoft ruling, plus reaction from Britain and the United States on BBC News 24 at 10 o'clock. Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe has told Britain to stop meddling in his country's affairs, but he has promised that the election will go ahead there in May. Britain's been increasingly critical of the economic and political chaos in Zimbabwe, which led to violence in Harare at the weekend. Today, the Foreign Secretary Robin Cook met Mr Mugabe at a Europe-Africa summit in Cairo.
Robin Cook and Robert Mugabe, a strained appearance for the cameras at the Africa-Europe summit. Their countries used to be firm friends, but in recent weeks the relationship between Britain and Zimbabwe has been turning sour. As opposition to President Mugabe's rule has grown, Britain and other European countries have been alarmed by the way he's reacted to it, at times with intimidation and violence. President Mugabe is smarting from the criticism.
When we have difficulties, you see, Britain has no right at all, to try and suggest to the rest of the world that we are a failure. Nor have they a right to try and suggest to us what we should do.
Sitting close to each other at the summit, Mr Cook and Mr Mugabe later made time to discuss their differences.
All our concerns were expressed, and I expressed the areas that we had worries about. I'm pleased that President Mugabe did give me an assurance that there would be elections in Zimbabwe next month in May. What I want is for the people of Zimbabwe to have the chance to choose their government itself and to have a free and a fair chance to do so, and I'm pleased to have that confirmation.
Another much criticised African figure, Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, appeared to have entered the cooperative spirit of the conference. Then, in closed session, he announced that Africa needed water pumps, not democracy. It was exactly the language European leaders didn't want to hear. The spat between Britain and Zimbabwe highlights the tensions between some African countries and their former colonial powers. Britain insists it was never the aim to lecture Zimbabwe, only to offer assistance. It's clear, however, that if Europe is to help with Africa's many problems, there'll be growing pressure on African leaders to promote democracy and the rule of law. Colin Blaine, BBC News, Cairo.
Here, refugee groups have criticised the government's latest plans to deal with growing numbers of asylum seekers. They're to be moved to sites around the country to relieve pressure on the southeast of England. And from now on, they'll be given food and clothing vouchers instead of cash.
Children from Kosovo, Afghanistan, Romania and Poland. This is the changing face of the UK.
Does Jane like running?
Thousands of asylum seekers are being forcibly moved across the country. Today, the government is phasing in its responsibility for dispersal, till now run by local authorities. 30 asylum seekers have been sent to this hostel in Essex. Ruth Singh is cut off from the Afghan community in London, but grateful for shelter.
We were exhausted. 21 days they took us to get here. Now we appreciate. We got a lot of privilege here.
But is this rural location the right one for an international community? Councils say the government should pay them an extra £30 million to find more suitable housing in multicultural areas. Some locals here in Langford resent their new neighbours.
Here there are no suitable facilities. There is no school, there is no medical centre, there isn't even a shop. And although we would welcome them if it was a suitable place.
Another key part of the Asylum Act sees all new arrivals given vouchers rather than money. A couple will be paid £57.37 each week. A child under 16, £26.60. Within the total, they'll get just £10 in cash. Oxfam is refusing to accept the vouchers, saying they'll bring added poverty and stigma. Overall, the government says the new policies will help stem the number of new arrivals. But critics question whether the government can really carry them out and whether they're fair. Geeta Gurumurthy, BBC News.
Tests have shown that mobile phones fitted with hand-free sets may not limit the amount of radiation to the head and could even increase it. Tests carried out for the Consumers Association found that 3 times as much radiation may be carried to the head by some sets compared to traditional models. At Carphone Warehouse, the manufacturers of one of the 2 models tested said its own research contradicted the findings. The Director General of the BBC, Greg Dyke, has ordered a massive shake-up in how the corporation is to be run. Hundreds of jobs could go in a drive to cut management costs, and much of the internal market introduced by his predecessor, John Birt, will be dismantled. Mr. Dyke said the money saved would go into programmes.
See you guys.
Greg Dyke arriving at Television Centre this morning. The BBC, he believes, has too many managers, too little leadership. Today, he spelt out what he means to do about it. Out goes the old 11-strong board, many of them with their own support staffs. In come 17 divisional directors, including many more programme makers. Out go the 190 business units trading in an internal market, to be replaced by just 50.
We have to cut management layers and duplication across the BBC.
In a speech to staff, Greg Dyke said the organisation needed to become more agile and less bureaucratic. Hundreds of middle managers could lose their jobs.
OK, nice and quiet, please. Stand by. Action.
In Birmingham, they're making a new daytime serial, Doctors. Greg Dyke's aim to spend more money on programmes for viewers and listeners by taking an axe to the BBC's costly bureaucracy.
At the moment, we spend 76% of our money on programmes and services and 24% on running the institution of the BBC. I want to reduce that by something like 10%. That way, we get another £200 million a year to spend on programmes.
John Birt, Greg Dyke's predecessor, who left in January, set up an internal market under which BBC channels bought programmes from a giant in-house production department. Now, many of Lord Birt's reforms are being dismantled.
The BBC is about to swap one management philosophy for another very different one. John Birt's reforms were designed to keep costs down and ensure the BBC knew where every penny went. Greg Dyke puts the emphasis on leadership and says he wants his managers to be free to manage. Nick Hyam, BBC News at Television Centre.
Sally Slater, the 6-year-old girl who received a donor heart at the weekend, is still very ill in hospital, but her parents are cautiously optimistic that she'll recover. Doctors in Newcastle explained today how they used a pioneering plastic heart to keep Sally alive while waiting for a donor to be found. The Prime Minister's wife, Sherry Booth, has launched sweeping changes to the legal aid system in England and Wales. From now on, people injured in accidents won't be able to get legal aid to sue for compensation. Instead, they'll have to find a solicitor prepared to work on a no-win, no-fee basis. The entry fee for national museums and galleries in England could be cut to just £1 from next year. The government wants more people to visit them. The final decision will lie with individual institutions. NATO says the net is closing around suspected war criminals still at large after its troops arrested Momcilo Krajisnik, a Bosnian Serb official charged with genocide and crimes against humanity. He's the highest-ranking suspect to be arrested by UN forces looking for those responsible for war crimes in Bosnia. After his arrest in Pale, he was taken to The Hague to be tried by the War Crimes Tribunal.
NATO troops used explosives to blast open the door of Momcilo Krajisnik's home. They were taking no chances. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when Mr. Krajisnik was dragged from his bed and led away barefoot and still in his pyjamas. He wasn't even allowed to get dressed. His 2 sons said they had their hands tied up with plastic restrainers. And Mr. Krajisnik's father ridiculed the NATO operation. If the troops had only knocked on the door, he said, I'd have opened it. French soldiers led the arrest operation, but it's thought British special forces may also have played a part. Momcilo Krajisnik is the highest-ranking suspect to be seized for war crimes in Bosnia. As a leader of the Serbs there, he often met senior Western politicians like the British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook. 3 years ago, he seemed happy to do business with Mr. Krajisnik, even to shake his hand. Now, though, Momcilo Krajisnik stands accused of helping to mastermind mass slaughter in Bosnia. He is charged with genocide and crimes against humanity.
Mr. Krajisnik is a big fish in the Bosnian Serb pond and in the affairs of what went on during the 90s in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So his arrest, I think, is a very big signal to all of those who have got a guilty conscience in the area that they can run, but they can't hide.
People like the Bosnian Serb military and political leaders Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic, both are war crime suspects who must be a little more anxious tonight as they hear that their old friend Momcilo Krajisnik has now arrived at The Hague to answer for what he did in Bosnia. The net of the War Crimes Tribunal may finally be closing in. Ben Brown, BBC News.
Here, nominations for the Mayor of London closed today. There's now just over a month to go before polling day. One of the biggest challenges for whoever wins is how to improve the capital's underground system. London's tube needs billions of pounds of investment. The big argument is over government plans to bring in private companies to improve tracks, tunnels, signals and stations.
The underground system at London Victoria is so crowded in the morning they have to keep people waiting outside. 300,000 commuters a day flood through here onto a system that's old and too often unreliable. There's never been and never will be enough taxpayers' money to modernise the tube. It's a problem that's got to be sorted out once and for all.
The tube needs billions and the government just can't afford it. So the question is not about whether the private sector should get involved, but how. Should city money be raised through bonds, leaving the public sector to run the system? Or would it be better if private companies got fully involved in the modernisation?
The government wants to hand over the job of upgrading the tracks, signals and stations to private firms. They'd borrow the money from the city. Responsibility for operating the system and for safety would stay with London Underground. They'd pay the private firms back according to how much the service improves. This idea is supported by Labour's official candidate Frank Dobson, and the government's advisers say it's the best value for money.
Well, basically, the public sector can concentrate what it's good at, which is running the train services and deciding the levels of services that it wants the private sector to deliver. The private sector does what it's good at, which is delivering those services efficiently and cheaply.
But a study by London Transport 2 years ago concluded that a public-private partnership wasn't the best deal. In fact, it was one of the worst.
It's basically due to its complexity. You've got all these interfaces between track and infrastructure operations, the different companies. It's very, very complicated. It's a field day for lawyers and accountants, but not a very good thing for the passengers, I don't think.
On New York's subway, improvements have been paid for through bonds, a system London Transport study said was one of the best options. A similar plan, with services publicly run, is supported by the Liberal Democrat candidate Susan Kramer and the independent Ken Livingstone. The Conservative Stephen Norris also wants New York-style bonds with private companies running the service. Tube experts say the debate between the government's public-private partnership, or PPP, and bonds is not only about best value, but about power.
I think it's really all about control and who decides. The PPP solution is the government deciding what's going to happen for 30 years. The bonding solution would be the mayor deciding, and that's the real issue.
The candidates are trying to influence the government now because they know ministers will make final decisions about the long-term funding of the tube before the new mayor takes control. Simon Montague, BBC News on London Underground.
Prince Charles has warned the new Food Standards Agency that too much regulation could lead to smaller producers being forced out of business. The new agency started work today by outlining a raft of new controls. It wants cases of salmonella halved within 5 years. Butchers face tough new meat hygiene rules in a campaign to cut the number of people getting food poisoning.
Top restaurants, caterers, all food businesses can expect greater scrutiny now the Food Standards Agency is up and running. It wants more rigorous safety inspections that are consistent throughout the UK. After the deadly E. coli outbreak in Lanarkshire in 1996, separating raw from cooked meat was found to be crucial. Now butchers will have to be licensed, undergoing hygiene training and putting stringent safety measures in place, as this independent retailer does, to reduce the risk of contaminated meat.
Like an estate agent, anybody can open up the door and set up shop. As we're after the food licensing labels, no one will be able to do that.
At its launch, the agency made clear some of its aims. It wants tougher meat hygiene regulations and a review of the controls on BSE. It also aims to reduce salmonella in UK-produced chickens by 50% in 5 years, and it wants an end to ambiguous food labels such as country style. Tonight, the Prince of Wales spoke up for food producers, urging the agency to be balanced. At a Radio 4 Food Awards ceremony, he warned it was impossible to regulate for perfection.
Excessive regulation, I suspect, will lead to only one thing. Small and specialty producers will reach threat overload. They will find the risk of legal action and the costs of meeting the regulations so great that they will just give up.
Meanwhile, the agency said protecting the public comes first.
We're going to be much more open. We're holding our board meetings in public, for example. We're an independent voice. We don't have to seek permission from ministers to publish our advice, and we're on the side of the consumer. So it's a radical change from what's gone before.
The new agency's got to be independent of government and industry. It'll be judged a success if it wins the trust of consumers and puts public health at the top of the agenda. Nicola Carslaw, BBC News.
More changes to the televising of Premiership football are on the way. The chairman of the 20 Premiership clubs want more live matches, including more pay-per-view games. They've spent the day discussing how to get the maximum coverage for the best price.
The money which football gets from television has brought the Premier League unprecedented riches and allowed English clubs to buy some of the world's highest paid players. The clubs want the success story to continue and are inviting broadcasters to bid for the rights to show their matches when the current contract expires at the end of next season. Currently, Sky show the Premiership live, with the BBC screening highlights on Match of the Day. The new deal will be more complicated, may let more broadcasters in on the act, and will certainly mean more football on television. The Premiership is putting several packages out to tender. The number of live matches on offer goes up from 60 to 66 every season. Another 40 games can be shown live on a pay-per-view basis. And there'll be highlights programmes on Saturday and Sunday night. The Premiership believes it won't mean overexposure.
If you look at the Football League attendances up for the last 13 seasons, if you look at the Premier League, continued to increase attendances since its inception in 1992. Football actually has managed very well the exposure and combining that with the attendance and combining that with generating the revenue. So as I say, we have no reason to suspect we won't continue to manage that in a balanced way.
The broadcasters will now decide how much they can offer to show Premiership football, and the new TV deal should be signed by the summer. The one question the Premier League won't answer is how much all this might be worth, but the various packages on offer will bring in considerably more than the £743 million the broadcasters currently pay. In terms of wealth, the Premiership is certain to remain in a league of its own. Neil Bennett, BBC News, at Premier League headquarters in London.
The main news again tonight. 12 million people's lives are at risk in a new Ethiopian famine. The UN's appealing for help as the Horn of Africa dries up. That's it. That's the latest from the newsroom this evening. Good night.
Good evening. Britain's highest mountain, Ben Nevis, is to be sold by its current owner. The conservation charity, the John Muir Trust, is taking over the 4,400-foot peak after it was offered to them below the market price.
Ben Nevis is one of the world's most famous mountains, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors to Lochaber every year. It's been owned by the same family for generations, but Duncan Fairfax Lucy's decided the time has come to sell. He's offered it to the Edinburgh-based John Muir Trust, named after the Scots-born environmentalist regarded as the father of modern conservation. The deal includes part of Glen Nevis, famously used as the location for Mel Gibson's Braveheart. The landowner approached the trust because he didn't want to sell it to the highest bidder on the open market.
I wanted it properly managed and kept for the future, and the John Muir Trust were the right people to do it. I think it's important the wildlife and general access to the place should be properly managed.
The new owners already have land in Skye, Sutherland, Perthshire and most notably Knoydart. They've guaranteed to maintain free public access to Ben Nevis, but will repair the main track to the summit and carry out environmental restoration.
The Scottish Football Association has taken over the management of Hampden Park. Under the deal with owners Queen's Park FC, the SFA will run the development on a 20-year lease.
Last May, the Scottish Cup was held aloft at Hampden, but behind the celebrations, financial trouble was brewing. 10 months on, a deal has at last been struck, thanks to more than £5.5 million of money from the Scottish Executive and other partners. The strain of the past few months showed on the faces of the SFA representatives today at a hastily called press conference.
To say that this has been a long and difficult process, I think, is a bit of an understatement. On a number of occasions, we thought we were very close to concluding a deal, but a number of obstacles were encountered along the way.
The SFA will now run the stadium for the next 20 years. During that time, it'll pay £800,000 to Queen's Park Football Club, who will act as landlords.
A report into the conditions untried prisoners are kept in has branded Glasgow's Barlinnie jail a national disgrace. Scotland's Chief Inspector of Prisons, Sir Clive Fairweather, criticised the ongoing practice of slopping out and highlighted complaints about cockroach-infested facilities and a shortage of clean underwear. Prison welfare groups say the executive must do more to find alternatives to custody for people awaiting trial. The Scottish arm of the Food Standards Agency has been opened in Aberdeen by the Scottish Health Minister. More than 50 staff will provide the Scottish Executive with independent safety advice. Susan Deacon said it's a major step forward in rebuilding public confidence after a series of food scares. That's all for now. Our next update will be in BBC Two Scotland in Newsnight Scotland at 11.
Hello there, good evening. Well, we've had a blast of northerly winds today that have fed in some very cold air across the British Isles. You can see what I mean here, really. We come on to some warmth in Jersey with a high of 15, but a mere 0 Celsius at Colwyn Bay this afternoon with a raw and really quite strong northerly wind. Now, those northerly winds have been feeding in some wintry weather as well. Snow has been in the forecast today, and it's still going to be with us through tonight and tomorrow. And that's caused all sorts of problems on the roads, particularly the higher parts of Derbyshire and also into Aberdeenshire. I wouldn't be surprised if we had more disruption in the next 12 hours. Flooding could well be a problem as well. We've had persistent wet weather from Somerset right up through the Midlands, up into Lincolnshire. And it's really on the western edge of this wet area where we've seen the snow falling, significant snow over the hills, and there'll be very little movement in this rain area or snow area through the rest of the evening and night. So further problems here, so we do keep that severe weather warning going. Looking at that then, for tonight, heavy rain and snow, really the big story for Yorkshire, the Midlands, Wales and southwest England. Rain mostly down at low levels, snow mostly over the hills, but we really could see a couple of inches or so of snow over the higher parts. And it does look as though some of that wintry weather could well get into the southeast of England during the latter part of the night or the early part of tomorrow. So that's something we will have to watch, and a cold night for all of us. But a sharp frost across Northern Ireland and Scotland with a strong wind and those clear skies, temperatures down to -4. Tomorrow then, well, a miserable start to the day in the south, a horrible rush hour I should think, with some sleet and snow around. Further north though, it'll be very much quieter, there will be some sunshine. I should think during the day some of that brighter weather will eventually spill down across the North Midlands, maybe North Wales, but it will stay rather cold and dank in the south, some sleet and snow, but possibly that easing through the second half of the day. And a cold day for all of us, especially in the south, with a high of 3 Celsius. That's it. Good evening to you.
It was never going to be easy.